Right then, some interesting developments on another front. The US President Donald Trump says his face-to-face meeting in Helsinki with his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin was a good start. After 2 hours of closed-door talks, the two leaders went to a working lunch with their senior advisors. Relations between Russia and the West have been severely strained ever since Moscow's annexation of Crimea, the Crimean Peninsula, from the Ukraine in 2014. Russia is also accused of meddling in the 2016 US election, a claim it has repeatedly denied. However, Mr. Putin now says that if the US really is a democracy, it ought to deal with the matter in court. Some US politicians had called for the summit to be cancelled after 12 Russian military intelligence officers were charged, or rather indicted on Friday, with hacking the presidential campaign of the Democratic candidate in 2016, Hillary Clinton. Right then, so let's expand this conversation. Guy Henderson is in Helsinki. Jessica Stone joins us from Washington, D.C. Guy, let me start with you. It does seem there was no concrete deal on anything here. Syria, the Crimean Peninsula, Iran, the lot. In that sense, wasn't this meeting a failure? Was it just an optics and propaganda win for President Putin after years in the cold?
Certainly not how either of these leaders portrayed it. They came out of that meeting behind closed doors, one-on-one with just translators for part of that meeting, claiming somewhat of a reset. We heard President Putin, as you'd mentioned there, talking about this being an important first step to improving ties. The two of them spoke about how they're going to be setting up various working groups to sort of rebuild lines of communication in various spheres that have broken down as this bilateral relationship has declined and disintegrated really in recent years. We heard President Trump say bilateral relations have never been worse until a few moments ago when they'd met. The problem, of course, is that this is the exact moment when in parts of Europe and certainly in the United States, there are calls for Moscow to instead be held to account for some of its alleged actions. Those were questions that came up repeatedly through that press conference, particularly when it came to alleged Russian meddling in the US election. Question after question to both leaders. President Putin saying absolute nonsense that we sought to meddle in the US election or may have colluded with the Trump campaign in some way. And then, continued pressing to the point where an AP journalist said, "Do you believe the claims of your own intelligence services, Donald Trump?" To which he replied, "I think they do good work, but," and sort of here's the bombshell really, he said that Putin's account during that meeting of a complete denial that there was really, any meddling on behalf of Russia. He said he found Putin's account extremely powerful. So that essentially put, this sort of odd scenario in that press conference where you had the Russian and American leaders standing side by side and almost sort of rebutting and accusing their own American intelligence services of essentially making this up.
Indeed. Jessica, let me come to you with that. So both parties, as Guy just mentioned, repeatedly saying no meddling, no collusion, nothing of the sort ever happened. And then the president basically throwing his intelligence agencies under the bus, publicly at that. How's this going to play out at this base?
Well, the Director of National Intelligence has just issued a statement, Rama, while we've been on the air, and he says, "We've been clear in our assessments of Russian meddling in the 2016 election and their ongoing pervasive efforts to undermine our democracy, and we will continue to provide unvarnished and objective intelligence in support of our national security." Now, he does not name the U.S. president, but of course, this is the agency among many that has continued to emphasize the unanimous conclusion that Russia did meddle in the 2016 election and is trying to do so in the upcoming congressional elections. In terms of how this is playing out here in the U.S., as one would expect, the Democrats, the opposition party, are calling U.S. President Donald Trump all sorts of names, but it's really in the comments made by people who traditionally support the president that it's very interesting to look at that. As I was looking through comments, I noticed that supporters are still backing his general concept of engaging in open dialogue with other world leaders, particularly leaders of countries that have traditionally been seen as adversaries or competitors. But that doesn't mean that they don't believe that Putin is responsible for the election meddling in 2016, and that's what they've said as much. The other interesting thing here is that, of course, President Trump often talks about this idea of peace through strength, the doctrine that Ronald Reagan championed when he was president. And you have to wonder if it was truly strong not to publicly confront Vladimir Putin, and not only for these allegations and the conclusions of the American intelligence apparatus, but also for the idea that he should stay out of the future elections. And so to not hear him say that publicly seems to have disappointed many on the right and to the president's supporters. Now, John McCain not being one of those, but a traditional Republican ally, he called this one of the most disgraceful performances by an American president in memory. Said Trump proved not only unable, but unwilling to stand up to Putin. Rama?
Indeed, of course. Just to add to that, some comments here from Senator Jeff Flake. Quote, "I never thought I would see the day when our American president would stand on the stage with the Russian president and place blame on the United States for Russian aggression. This is shameful." Guy, there's also an economic angle to all of this. Trade and economic sanctions are in place really on both sides. So isn't this proposal that we heard to have a panel of top-level businessmen on both sides ironing out any economic or trade issues, isn't that proposal effectively dead on arrival?
Well, it's sort of interesting if you consider some of the context, some of the comments that Donald Trump was making a few days ago, singling out Germany, where he was saying that Germany should not be giving billions of dollars to Russia in the form of a big gas deal pipeline called Nord Stream 2, which would essentially, in the views of Donald Trump, make Germany and Europe to rely too much on Russian gas. But his essential argument was, why would you be giving money to a country, Russia, that the United States is trying to protect you from, that is an adversary? So certainly some irony there, I think. And of course, at the moment, the United States and the European Union has sanctions on Russia, specifically for its annexation of Crimea back in 2014. And according to President Putin, during that press conference, Trump had at least held firm on the US position there. He hadn't given too much away, and he has said in the past, the US president, that he's not happy about the situation in Ukraine. So, on the one hand, continued sanctions. The US hasn't officially changed its position on that. Still apparently unhappy about Ukraine. But at the same time, an agreement behind closed doors here between these two leaders to sort of get captains of industry together, as they say, to start talking about doing business together.
Indeed. Jessica, let me come to you. The president spent, as Guy has rightly pointed out, because he covered part of this, the president spent most of last week hammering Germany for buying natural gas from Russia. But how competitive can American LNG be in the European market? Could we be looking at a potential price war here to essentially Russia's disadvantage?
Well, I don't think that that's going to happen anytime soon. As you well know, there is more natural gas being produced here in the United States than there is in Russia. But obviously, Russia already has 3 gas pipelines into Europe, is building another 2. And the U.S. has to transport its natural gas by boat. Its biggest trading partners right now with respect to its liquefied natural gas are Mexico, China, and the ROK, places it can get to by water. And it also only has one facility with which to export LNG. So it's really not anywhere close to being able to compete with Russia with respect to getting LNG to those pipelines. That said, it's certainly a rallying point politically for President Trump and his supporters, and something that is definitely something that the president and the Republican Party want to achieve over the course of this presidency.
Indeed, and of course there's that not so small matter of a little trade dispute running across both sides of the Atlantic. We'll leave it there for the time being. Thank you very much for that. That was Jessica Stone in Washington DC and Guy Henderson in Helsinki.